It's going to do that with the pictures. And then I'm just going to assume we're recording. So I will say hello, everybody. I'm your host, Eric Smith, and we're going to jump right into my favorite horror with talented author, close personal friend, I like to think, Allan Gunnells. Welcome, Mark.
And of course, you're a close personal friend.
How's everything going?
Things are pretty good here. I can't complain.
Well, you could.
In some ways, the world is on fire, but
Yes, that's true.
I'm maintaining, and things are going on.
Things are a little crazy in the world, and I think we're all just trying to, live our lives and not let it get us down, and of course, trying to help in any way we can.
Of course.
Not that there's much a lot of us can do, except donate, I think.
Yeah.
All right. Well, what have you been up to? What have you been reading? What have you been watching? What's your entertainment like?
Well, I've been reading a little everything. Right now, I'm reading Moon Lake by Joe Lansdale, and I just finished a very weird and quirky Southern novel called Cold Sassy Tree. And I got to read an advanced reader's copy of a collection called Effects Vary by Michael Harris Cohen, which doesn't come out until late this year. But that was excellent. I've been watching. We finally got to see the new Scream.
What did you think?
I liked it. I'm a big Scream fan. The first one came out when I was in college. It felt like it was made for me. And unlike some of the more recent requels or whatever they call them, I felt this one was very much in keeping with the spirit of the original. And what I like the fact that it just keeps the consistent continuity. It doesn't throw anything out. There may be films that some people hated, but it's still just part of the canon, and they just keep moving forward. In this day and age, I feel like that's rare, and I appreciate it.
Yes. I think there might be a franchise that threw out about 10 or 11 movies.
Twice they've thrown out movies. So it's rare.
I have not seen the new Scream yet. I'm looking forward to seeing it. I like 3 of the 4 that I have seen.
I like 3 of the 4. I'm gonna guess that the one oddball for us is probably different, but
interesting,
because I feel like the one I like the least is different from the one that everyone else likes the least. But
well, then I'm gonna guess. This is tough because I think they're both really good. I'm gonna guess 2 is your least favorite.
Actually, I love 2.
Okay.
1 is my favorite, but 2 is the one I find the most rewatchable.
Okay.
Something about that one that I just really get into.
So you're not a fan of 4?
4 didn't do it entirely for me.
Interesting. See,
what really killed it for me was the ending, the hospital ending.
Well, I do wish, and I mean, the movie's been out forever, but spoilers for anyone that hasn't seen it. I really, really wish the killer would have gotten away with it.
See, that's what I thought they were going to do, and I thought that would be interesting. But even if they weren't going to do that, there was something so ridiculous to me about that hospital ending where someone they said was so near death they didn't know she was going to make it was suddenly fighting like the Terminator.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. And then there was nobody in that hospital. No doctors, no nurses. There were gunshots. Nobody came running. I'm like, something is awful about that. But I didn't hate it. There were parts of it I really liked. I'm a big fan of the meta aspect of those movies. And that one in particular was sort of making a comment on reboots, which was interesting. And the new one, which is making a comment on the new requel thing that's going on, and which I was very happy of, because when I first heard about the new one, they suggested that it wasn't going to have that meta aspect. When I first read about it, they said they were going to play it more straight, but it definitely still has that commenting on itself and commenting on the genre aspect, and I'm glad they didn't lose that.
Well, I mean, I think they, in 4 especially, I think they kind of took that meta thing with, because it had what, 3-4 beginnings?
Yeah.
That movie. You think you're watching the movie, but then it's 2 people in the living room watching a movie. And so now you think that's the movie, but then that turns out to be a movie within a movie within a movie within a movie.
But I don't know. I think what I like so much about that series also is that it doesn't. Most horror franchises are just different characters and then the same killer.
Right.
But it's a different killer every time, but you're following the same core group, which I find very interesting. And my favorite part of every sequel is sort of catching up with them and finding out what they've been doing since the last movie.
Sure. Well, like I said, I'm looking forward to seeing the new one. Have you watched anything else worth mentioning anyway?
We did watch Contagion the other night, which is from 2011, and it is so nailed everything that happened with the pandemic, right down to people not wanting to take the vaccine, that I'm like, I told my husband, it's not that that movie was prophetic. It's just that what happened was so predictable, it should have been preventable.
Right.
I mean, it was kind of surreal watching it, knowing that this was like years before the pandemic happened, but it was just hitting everything that happened. And I thought, people probably watched this movie at the time and thought, oh, these characters are so stupid. But then during the actual pandemic, we're doing the same behaviors and probably not even recognizing it. But and the Walking Dead is back on, and we are still watching. I know it's not always fashionable to say, but we're still watching. We're still fans. We're interested to see how it ends. They brought Maggie back, so I'm all the way back in.
Well, what do you think of the new spinoff that they announced?
Well, I don't like that they're announcing all these spinoffs beforehand, because I feel like it's just, well, now I know these people are going to make it. I mean, I feel like it's taking away some of the, I feel like in the early seasons when they, like for instance, when they got rid of a character, it was a surprise, like you didn't know it was coming. Mm-hmm. But now when they get rid of characters, they announce it beforehand, like, oh, they'll be leaving the show. And I'm like, well, you're taking away some of the surprise of actually discovering it in the show. But I'll watch anything with Maggie in it, because I am a Maggie enthusiast. I was so upset when she left the show.
I do think I guess it depends on what you consider early seasons. I did feel they sort of, I lost the word I was looking for, but foreshadowed isn't really quite right, but would foreshadow who was going to die. And the biggest example I can think of is Beth. Because as soon as they started doing episodes almost completely focused on Beth, I said, she's dead. They're just building her up so they can kill her for that shock factor.
I didn't see the Beth thing coming, but I did think it was right after she finally got to be a character. For a while there, Beth didn't do anything. But,
right, and maybe that's just the way my mind works, but she was just sort of a background character, and as soon as the focus was on her, I was like, they're killing her.
And I liked, because they did that thing like when they all got dispersed from the prison, where they were all separated. And I like when they do that sometimes, because they put unexpected people together.
Mm-hmm.
Like they put her and Daryl together, who had never really had much interaction. And I'm like, sometimes that really turns out to be something interesting when you put characters that aren't normally together like that.
I stopped watching when they were still at the prison. And I came back for a short time because I wanted to see, again, spoilers, people, for something that's years and years old. I wanted to see Carol kill the young girl, and I knew it was coming.
Yeah.
Based on what I was hearing from people and based on what I know happened in the comic book. So I watched probably from that episode where she killed the girl to the end of that season, which is when they were in Alexandria and the dumbass left the gate open and all the zombies got in.
Yeah.
Have you read the comics?
I read them up to a point, but I never read the whole series. So to me, like, I don't know what from the show is. Sometimes I can tell when outfits are from the comics. I'm like, that's a ridiculous looking outfit, but it probably looked cool in a panel. And there are certain characters, like there was a army guy named Abraham, and I'm like, I bet his dialogue looked cool in a word bubble. The actor actually say it doesn't always translate the same way.
Mm-hmm.
But they introduced a new character last season called Princess, and I did find out her outfit was from the comic because I'm like, that is ridiculous. And they've only finally let her stop wearing that outfit. Now she just looks like a person. Although I'm very baffled how this many years into the apocalypse, they are still finding wonderful clothes that are perfectly clean and pressed and like interesting.
I can't remember where it was, but just recently there was someone talking about that sort of thing where you have either it's a post-apocalyptic world, but everybody's hair is great and their teeth are great and they still look beautiful. Or you have a guy at work mentioned he hates when you have like a homeless character who just looks horrible but perfect teeth.
Yeah.
And it's yeah.
I think the show has gotten better at making them look more grunged up, but their clothes are still immaculate. It's sometimes amazing. Like you think even if they found a department store by now, those clothes would just have gone to rot.
You'd think. Now, in the comics, did you get to the point that basically is the parallel of Carol killing the young girl?
I only got to the point where they left the prison.
Okay.
Which was, I mean, very different, like a very different
Right.
trajectory. Well, first of all, Rick only had one arm by that point.
Yes.
And there was a very different trajectory for the baby he and Lori had.
Oh, yeah, and I really wish they would have done that in the show.
But although I will say I mean, you probably haven't seen it since they time jumped and now Judith the baby is like a young girl.
Right.
But I like her a lot better than Carl. So even though she now wears that damn.
In the comic, after they left the prison, somewhere they hooked up. There were two young boys, two brothers. One of them was a sociopath, essentially. Basically, it was like the two girls were in the show, and they were still on the road. They still had the RV and everything, and the kid killed somebody because he wanted to see what would I'm experimenting. I believe he killed somebody, and the adults, they put him in the RV. They locked him in the RV, and they're like, "Look, we got to figure out what we're going to do with this kid. Let's sleep on it, and we'll decide tomorrow morning." And then in the middle of the night, there's a gunshot. Everybody jumps up. They run to the RV. Carl comes out of the RV with a smoking gun. He's like, "I took care of it." I loved that. And so I wanted to see how they would play that, since I knew it was coming up with Carol and the two girls.
I don't know, I do remember in the comics when they were in the prison, there was a section where it was like a murder mystery because somebody was murdering people in the prison, and I was kind of disappointed that didn't play out in the series, because that was one of my favorite parts of the comic when they were in the prison.
The last part I read in the comic, shortly after what I just described, and they find this nice suburb full of cannibals. And I think Dale was still alive at that point. I think Dale got captured by the cannibals and they ate part of him. And Rick and the crew rescued him, wiped out the cannibals, and then Dale turned, so they had to kill him. I believe, and I think that's the last part that I read in the comic. Yeah. Have you watched the spin-offs that they already have? Fear the Walking Dead, and then the other one I can't remember the name of.
We watched Fear the Walking Dead. We're not as big a fan of it. And then I think the other one was called World Beyond. We started it, but it wasn't doing anything for us, so we stopped. One thing we do complain about is on both Fear the Walking Dead and The Walking Dead, they have what we call theoretically gay characters, where, because it's Aaron on The Walking Dead and I can't think of that character's name on Fear the Walking Dead, but if you watched the last 3 or 4 years of the show, you wouldn't even know those characters were gay. It's just something that was mentioned before, and now everybody around them is constantly hooking up, but they're just these asexual beings that, and I'm like, because my husband and I were talking about, because they did this on Downton Abbey with a gay character. Like, even if you don't have anyone, and you're watching everyone around you, that's going to lead to some frustration, some loneliness, some bitterness. That you don't have to have a character have sex to have sexuality. It's noticeable to me when they take those characters and they're like, oh, he's gay, but then that's it. He never has any feelings for anyone, and I'm like, it's noticeable, and it's usually just the male characters. The lesbian characters can have sex lives.
Well, of course, because that's hot.
But the gay characters are just sort of, so, that's something we complain about, and something I always, when straight writers ask me, like, how should I handle gay characters? I'm like, make them as fully realized as everybody else. That means they have sexuality. That doesn't mean you have to have them having sex in your story, but they're going to have that part of human nature as well. So I got off on a tangent.
On The Walking Dead, was Aaron male or female?
Male.
Okay, because, again, been a long time since I've seen it, but I thought there was that group at one point that was Abraham, Eugene, and there were 2 women. And I thought one of them was gay. One of the women was gay.
Yeah, that was Tara.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's why, and now they have new lesbian characters on there now. But like the lesbians and Aaron had a boyfriend when he first came on, who just disappeared into the background. Like, he literally would sometimes just be seen in the background and have no dialogue, but they didn't have like scenes together. There was no like intimacy between them after that very first episode, which caused a big thing because it showed them kiss, but you never saw them kiss again. And that the boyfriend character literally had almost no dialogue until they killed him. He got to say some stuff in the episode where they killed him. And then since then, like I said, if you started watching from then on, you would have no idea Aaron was supposed to be a gay character. And then they had a second gay character named Jesus.
Right. Oh, I didn't know Jesus was gay.
Because in one episode, he told Maggie he was gay, and then that was it.
Okay.
Yes, and there was never, like, he and Aaron became friends, so we thought, oh, maybe, but then no, nothing happened there. Like, just completely asexual after that. So I'm like, but anyway, we're we're just all over the place, but I like it.
That's what we're here for. We're here to talk about this stuff before we get to the main event. And so with all of this, now are you a Star Wars fan? I can't recall.
Um, I mean, I grew up loving the original trilogy.
Okay.
I did not care for the prequels at all.
Mm-hmm.
I did like the first two of the new trilogy, but I haven't yet seen the third one because I was watching them on Netflix, but then they don't go on Netflix anymore. They go on Disney, and I don't have that. So
Okay.
I haven't seen them yet.
All right.
But I saw the little spin-off movies, Rogue One and the Han Solo movie, and I like those too.
Okay. But it doesn't sound like you're such a big fan that you read any of the novels or anything.
I have not.
Okay. When Disney took over and they said all of these novels that have come out up to this point are now called legends. They're no longer part of canon. Chuck Wendig wrote the first canon novels, new canon, whatever you want to call it, Disney canon. And there was a huge controversy because he introduced gay characters.
Yeah, I do remember the controversy.
And so being not gay, I don't know how gay readers take it. And you talked about in The Walking Dead how they don't really, they're like, oh, they're gay, and then that's it, and there's no relationships or anything. So in the first of Chuck Wendig's books, it's there is a character that has two mothers, but they're not a big character. That's not a big part of it. But one of the main characters in the book, later in the book, this woman hits on him, and he simply says, "I don't date women." And for the book, that's it.
Yeah.
That's the only statement that he is gay. And of course, people went insane over that. Now, with just that knowledge, now would you be, I want to say satisfied, because relationships with these characters in this particular book, it's not about the relationships that they have. So would you see that as just pandering to an audience, or just throwing it in there to throw in there, or would you be glad to see that in the Star Wars universe?
Well, I mean, I'm always glad to see an expansion of gay characters and things, especially beloved series. And I do think it depends on the story because some stories are very narrowly focused. And like in some short stories I write, that it's not going to come up because it's a very narrow focus. Like the thing about The Walking Dead is you're watching these characters for years. So it's very noticeable when they just leave that part of a character out when every other character around them has it. So what I'm really looking at is, are you treating this character like every other character? Because I mean, I'm not going to specific. There was a writer who wrote a novel that had a gay main character, but it was one of those, said he was gay at the beginning and then nothing. And then people said, well, it's a post-apocalyptic story. He's not going to have time to be thinking about romance. But the same writer wrote another post-apocalyptic novel with a straight character who did have time for romance.
Right.
So the thing is, you're treating that character differently, and that's noticeable to me. So if it's a narrowly focused story where no characters are really focused on that way,
right,
it's, to me, are you treating them like you're treating the other characters? Because I'll be honest, I don't mind being pandered to.
Okay.
Well, they just put a gay character in there to pander. I'm like, well, then great, because there was a time where putting a gay character in it meant death to whatever it was. So I like that we are now considered a viable audience to pander to. But if you're going to pander to me, then actually give me something. Don't just throw it in and say it at the beginning and think that's enough. Again, treat that character like every other character in the story. So if every other character has some sort of exploration of their romantic life, or, and I mean, so that's what I look for is, are you treating them different? Because I can't speak for all gay people, but I'm going to say a gay audience is going to notice if they're not being given the same dynamic lives that the straight characters around them are getting.
Well, I do think all of the other characters were treated the same. I don't think there wasn't any hooking up. It was a very mission focused story. And to be fair, it was either the second or third book of the trilogy, they do introduce that character's husband. I think it's his husband, or they're engaged, or long-term relationship, and make that a character. When the story sort of opens up and expands, and now we're seeing the home lives of the different characters, we do get him and his significant other, the way we get it with the other characters.
Yeah,
but
that's the big thing for me.
But when the first book came out, and it was as simple as a character saying, "I don't date women," and people went insane.
I see that all the time. Basically, they don't want us to exist, is the thing. And they always talk about how they don't want it forced in. I'm like, how is it any more forced in than having a character who does date women? Like, if we exist, then we should just be in there. But like, I don't know. It's so weird. They feel like we shouldn't exist unless it's a story that is specifically about that, so they'll know they can avoid it. You know what I mean? That's basically what happened with that Aaron character, because in the first episode he ever appeared in, they showed him kissing his boyfriend. People lost their shit, and then that boyfriend just disappeared after that. Like I said, there would be long stretches where I'd be like, is he still around? And then again, there would be a scene where he was in the background, but I'm like, they never had any kind of interaction, and certainly never kissed again. So I don't know, but I feel like there are always going to be people who react like that, but I feel like more and more we're getting a much more sophisticated audience that can appreciate a diverse range of characters. So I hope it just continues on that trajectory.
Well, are there any shows, and I know you're not the spokesman for the gay community, but are there any shows that you can think of that aren't specifically targeted towards a gay audience that does gay characters well?
Well, I loved, which a lot of people do, I love Schitt's Creek.
Okay.
Which was a ridiculously over-the-top comedy that became surprisingly emotionally resonant. And midway, or maybe a little past the midway point, they introduced this, what I thought was a beautifully done gay love story that then, it didn't take over the show, but it became a big part of the show. And I felt like I get excited when, and it doesn't have to even be a gay love story, but when a story introduces characters that I actually am so invested in wanting them to be together. And I thought that one did it beautifully. And this is going back ways. And again, it was, Joss Whedon is not, I do think the Willow Tara relationship on that show developed very beautifully. I do think, especially at that time, I don't think they could have done that with two male characters. I don't think people would have really gotten behind it the same way, but it was still very well.
See, that's the first show that comes to my mind.
Yeah. But I'm trying to think of other shows that have just gay characters that I think handle it very well. I mean, I definitely feel like you get a lot more shows now that have gay characters, which when I was growing up, I never would have believed there would be a time like that. Because I mean, there were not gay characters on TV unless it was some one-off episode like Designing Women where he was going to be dead by AIDS by the end anyway. So I mean, it's kind of amazing how many shows, because even like, the show Dead to Me on Netflix, which is very good, like one of those main characters ends up in a lesbian relationship. Actually, there was a show which is tangentially related to Schitt's Creek because one of the stars went on to be in a show called Kevin Can Fuck Himself.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the characters on that show turned out to be a lesbian. And I actually thought that was handled very well and was an interesting part of that character, mostly because she came to that realization so late in her life, and then had this whole thing where she was like, she wasn't ashamed of being gay, but she was embarrassed that it took her so long to like really come to terms with it. But I actually, because I did not expect that when I started watching the show, and I thought that was done very well. I'm trying to think of specifically ones with gay male characters though, and I'm having a hard time.
Well, this isn't going to be a male character, but I don't know if you ever saw the show Stumptown.
Mm-mm.
It was only on for one season, unfortunately. It was a victim of the pandemic, but the main character was a bisexual woman, and it was never a big deal on the show. It was just sometimes she'd hook up with a guy, sometimes she'd hook up with a woman. But it wasn't like, a very special episode of Stumptown or anything. It was just part of the character. It was never highlighted. It's just, this is the life.
Well, they also did, I mean, this has been several years back now, but they did a spinoff to Doctor Who called Torchwood.
Mm-hmm. Oh, love Torchwood.
Yeah. The main character was, I think, technically bisexual.
I believe he called himself omnisexual.
Okay. I stand corrected. But, I mean, he had a very extended, like, romance with one of the other male characters on the show. So it wasn't like, they just said that but he was still always with a woman. And I remember watching that and being impressed that, they really explored that side. I remember, I think there were two like traditional seasons, and then I think the third season really felt more like a mini series. And I really liked that one a lot. And then they did a fourth season that was also like that. It was not as well done as the third season, but I was all excited because one of an actress from 6 Feet Under was on that fourth season.
Was it? I'm trying to remember if it was 2 or 3 regular seasons. And then the first mini series thing was the one with the children.
Yes, and that's the one I really liked.
And then I didn't see the one after that.
I know a lot of people didn't like it because he came to America, so it felt a little more Americanized, and it was still an interesting story. But then I felt like they ended it in a way where they were sort of setting up for more, but then they never made any more.
Well, I know they're continuing. Or at least they were doing like audio shows, almost like radio shows, continuing the stories that way. And of course, there's novels and things. I have, like, Sarah Pinborough has written a couple of Torchwood novels.
Yeah, I heard that.
Mark Morris, some authors that I really like. I have a couple of them somewhere.
It's always interesting how they can continue things now. Like, I was a fan of Veronica Mars back in the day.
Yep.
And then it got canceled after the third season. Years later, they had a crowdfunding campaign that funded a film. And then after the film, the creator of the show wrote 2 novels that took place after the movie. And then Hulu had a revival series that actually referenced things from those 2 novels to keep it in continuity.
I've seen the original series, I've seen the movie, I've read both novels. I have the Hulu season on DVD. I have not watched it yet.
It was pretty good. I think almost everybody was back except for Mac, the computer hacker girl.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what happened to that actress, but she's the only one I think that didn't return for it.
I would love any more Veronica. I would love more Veronica Mars novels.
Yeah.
But
yeah, I like that show a lot.
And I liked his, I don't know if technically it was his follow-up, but iZombie was another Rob Thomas show based on a comic book.
I haven't actually seen that one yet.
I really liked that a lot.
I know we were big fans of Santa Clarita Diet with Drew Barrymore.
Yeah, I never saw that.
It was really good, but then they canceled it abruptly. So
I think iZombie was on for 4 or 5 seasons. Very different from the comic book, but I found it entertaining. I loved the cast. The bad guy in it, one of my favorite bad guys ever. Like Spike level entertaining. Spike from Buffy, of course.
Did it have a conclusion, or was it?
You know what? I did not finish the last season, so I don't know. But it was
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say it was sort of a mystery of the week show with an almost the Buffy model or the Veronica Mars model, with a mystery of the week, but then an overarching theme or story each season. And it really got, like, it took place in Seattle, I believe, and by the 3rd or 4th season, Seattle was completely walled off away from the rest of the country because of zombies. So they went to some interesting places.
I do have it's frustrating sometimes when I get into a show and it gets canceled, because I remember I got really into a show with Eliza Dushku. It was right after Buffy, and she did a show called True Calling.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the weirdest one for me, because they did a whole season. The network picked it up for a 2nd season, let them start filming episodes, and I think they were like 6 episodes into filming when the network changed its mind. So I'm like, they actually let them come back to work before they decided, no, on second thought, you're canceled.
I couldn't get into True Calling.
Oh,
I just didn't.
I loved it. I thought it got better and like, did you make it to when Jason Priestley joined?
I think I watched 1 episode and it just didn't grab me.
It got so good when Jason Priestley joined, because, the whole premise was she worked at a morgue and dead people would ask her for help, and then her day would restart and she would try to save them. Well, when Jason Priestley came on, it turned out his day reset too, only he was trying to make sure they still died. And they both thought they were the good guy.
Right.
They both thought they were trying to preserve the natural order of things. And I thought that weird dichotomy of, and also you never knew which one was going to win, because sometimes she came out on top in an episode and sometimes he did. So I don't know. I thought it was so interesting, and then it just seems so weird to me that, like I said, they let them start filming a whole other season, and then we're like, no. And they eventually just released those 6 episodes on DVD.
Well, I did watch Dollhouse.
I watched that too.
And I think we may have talked about this before. I was very excited for it because I was an Eliza Dushku fan. When it was airing, when I was watching it live, did not get into it. But once the show was over and I watched it on DVD, because there was a short time between moving from one place to another where I had canceled my cable.
Yeah.
And so all I was watching was stuff I was getting from the library. And I basically binge watched both seasons of Dollhouse and loved them.
Yeah.
But Eliza Dushku was my least favorite part of it.
Well, they had some really good characters that went into some unexpected places. I think her name was Sierra was my favorite. But I almost didn't watch that just because I was afraid. Because after Firefly, I'm like, I'm gonna start watching this. I'm gonna like it. We're gonna cancel it. But I ended up watching it, and I did like it. And then I was like, are they gonna cancel it? But they gave it that second season to wrap things up.
Right. I don't know. I don't know if I was expecting something like The Pretender, because I loved that show.
I used to watch that too.
And so I don't, because the idea that she's a blank slate essentially, and they imprint whatever personality on her. And I don't know. In my head, maybe I was just like, oh, it's going to be kind of like The Pretender, where she's going to be a completely different person every episode. But I don't know. I just, like I said, when it was airing, I could not get into it. But going back and watching it, I absolutely loved it.
Yeah.
All right. Anything else you want to chat about before we get to the main event?
I think we've covered a lot of bases.
Okay. First, we're going to do our fake commercials. I don't think I did this the first time you were on the show. Something I've started. I'm trying to get anybody to sponsor this show. So I have fake sponsors, and I try to tie it in to whatever we're talking about. So this is our fake ad. This episode of My Favorite Horror With is not sponsored by the board game The Hunger by Richard Garfield from Renegade Games. It's a deck building game in which you play a vampire, and you start in your castle up in the mountains, and you play your cards to move into the village and hunt people, and you can get familiars and vampire powers and treasures. You're trying to get points. You're moving through the village. If you can get all the way to the labyrinth, they call it, you can get a super powerful card. But if you do not make it back to the castle by sunrise, you burn up, and it doesn't matter how many points you have, you're out of the game. I love deck building games. Richard Garfield is the creator of Magic the Gathering. He's made all sorts of great games. So this, I think, is a lot of fun, and it's vampires. So, folks, if you're into board games, pick up The Hunger. Just came out a few months ago. Not that long ago, right before Christmas, I think. But there it is. That's our non-sponsor for this episode, The Hunger by Richard Garfield and Renegade Games. All right, with that out of the way, your choice for My Favorite Horror With is, what is it? You can tell us.
A bit of a controversial choice, but I chose the novel Interview with the Vampire by the late Anne Rice.
Here we go.
Work in my my youth, so and still one that's very, very close to my heart.
Oh, I didn't realize before we started recording and you showed me you had that, I didn't realize it was the hardback. Fancy.
I have all of the Vampire Chronicles in hardback. Now, I did not originally have this one in hardback. I had a paperback of this and the second one. But then going forward, I had them all in hardback. So I'm like, well,
yeah, I
can't just have those in paperback. So, and plus, I love this original cover for
it.
The paperback I had a cheesy
cover. All right. Before we dig in, can you give us a very quick synopsis of what the story is?
Well, I mean, it is literally an interview with the vampire, but it is a vampire telling someone the story of his life as a vampire. It's what I call an episodic novel, and that it really doesn't have one main plot. It's just all these different adventures he has as a vampire. When he meets the vampire Lestat, who turns him into a vampire, his struggles, them turning a child into a vampire, Claudia, the eventual turning against Lestat, traveling overseas, meeting other vampires. So, I mean, it really is kind of this rollicking just series of adventures and events that are all just... It's also just tied into this meditation of good and evil, and why are we here? Can we be good? Are we just doomed to be evil? And so, I mean, because everyone knows Anne Rice loves to get sort of philosophical with her mind. And this was one of, I'm not going to say the first, because Frankenstein was a very philosophical monster if you've read the novel. But it's very much in that Gothic tradition.
Got my Frankenstein quote right there.
So, to me, this is very much in that tradition, and I've always loved this novel. And it's actually not my favorite novel in the series, but it is the one that made me fall in love, not with just the series, but with Anne Rice. And I mean, we'll get into later, like, there's a lot of reasons why it resonated so strongly with me.
Right. Normally, this is where I would ask for a quick reason why you chose this, but I think that's going to be a big part of the discussion, and not something you're just going to want to answer very quickly. So we'll table that. Now, is Lestat the second book to come out in the series? Okay.
Yeah.
Can you name, off the top of your head, can you name the books and the order that they go in?
Let me see.
Little quiz.
I know point. It's Interview with the Vampire, The Vampire Lestat, The Queen of the Damned, The Tale of the Body Thief, Memnoch the Devil. And then this is where, because she had like some little novellas that came out, and I forget what order, but I know it was The Vampire Armand, and then Pandora was in there, and then Blood and Gold, and then Vittorio the Vampire was in there. And then it was Merrick, which was the first kind of crossover novel she did with the witch books. And then it was Blackwood Farm, Blood Canticle, and then she didn't write them for 10 years. And then it was Prince Lestat, Realms of Atlantis, and the last one, which will be the last one, Blood Communion.
Okay. Now, is the chronology sort of mixed up amongst all of these books?
Well, a lot of these books have like whatever's happening in the present day, but then not all of them, because some of them do take place entirely in the present day, but most of them then go back in time to tell stories of different vampires. The Vampire Lestat, Queen of the Damned, Tale of the Body Thief, and Memnoch the Devil are pretty, like, time-wise straightforward.
Okay.
But then she's back and she's telling the stories of different vampires. Vampire Armand, Marius, Pandora, Vittorio. So those are a little out of that chronology. But then when she comes back with Merrick, from there, it pretty much goes straightforward. Except, like I said, for those excursions into the past when she wants to tell the story of different vampires.
Okay. Well, yeah, it's when you mentioned Armand being a novella, I was like, oh, I wonder if that sort of goes back to tell us maybe before he... now, is it Louis?
Yeah,
Louis? I never know. So I was wondering if Armand was maybe the story before he met Louis.
Because if you've read, something very significant happens with Armand at the end of Memnoch the Devil. So the present day story of the Vampire Armand is dealing with that. but then it goes back all the way. I mean, like basically from his childhood
Okay.
up until he became a vampire, and it just tells his entire story, and then it retells parts that have already been told in the previous novels, but it goes much further back and much more in depth about him.
Okay. I do find it interesting, at least in the hands of a talented writer, when you can eventually see the same events from two different perspectives.
And I mean, that was what she always says was the reason she wrote The Vampire Lestat, was because when she finished Interview with the Vampire, she felt like Lestat would have a very different story to tell about those events.
Mm-hmm.
She was interested in that, and that's how. And then, of course, once she wrote that one, he just sort of took over the whole series. Because he was really only a small part of Interview with the Vampire and, you know, kind of the bad guy.
Was there a significant amount of time between Interview with the Vampire and Lestat coming out?
There was. I can't remember how many years it was, but she wrote a series of non-horror historical novels, which are actually very good. Cry to Heaven, Feast of All Saints, which was also a really good miniseries on Showtime. But because we watched that right after she died, just because I was very emotional. But I think I remember her saying in an interview it was 9 years before she actually went back and wrote Vampire Lestat, because she never really thought of it as a series, but once she wrote The Vampire Lestat, that's when she realized she had a sustainable series.
Okay. Now, full disclosure, I am not a huge fan of this book. I have only read 2 Anne Rice books, this one, Interview with the Vampire, and The Mummy. And my recollection is I liked The Mummy more.
Well, The Mummy is, I do love The Mummy too. The Mummy is a much lighter kind of adventure romp. But I mean, I reread it right before that first book that she and her son wrote together, which was a sequel.
Mm-hmm.
And I had forgotten just how good and fun The Mummy was.
Yeah. So that being said, you're going to have to kind of do the heavy lifting here, because it has been literally decades since I have read this book. I didn't hate it. It's sort of in the neutral zone of books for me. You know, I didn't dislike it in any way, but it didn't do anything for me. It was fine. I read a book. It was fine. I was entertained. At the time, I was not a huge vampire fan at all. I used to really, really dislike vampires. As a matter of fact, a friend of mine made up a mock T-shirt for me with a quote of mine saying, "Vampires are the Jar Jar Binks of the monster world." I have since changed my tune. I'm coming around to the vampire way. So maybe I should go back and reread this.
Well, I would recommend. My husband recently read it for the first time, but he loved the movie, which I think was why he wanted to read the book. But we were polar opposites. In my teens, especially, I was vampire obsessed. I was just writing about nothing but vampires. I was reading almost nothing but vampires, and so it just seemed natural. Eventually, I would read this one. It wasn't the first book. I first read The Witching Hour by her. Like, I dived into the deep end because that one's like 1,000 pages long. That was like a Stephen King sized book. But Interview was the second book I read by her, and to me, it was doing. And I mean, I know it has this reputation that it sort of changed the way vampire stories were told, but I mean, everything I was reading was very much like vampires, the complete villains, the evil, blood-sucking fiends. Not that I don't enjoy those, but when I read Interview with the Vampire, it was so different, giving us that flipping the perspective so that the vampires were the main characters. They were the ones whose thoughts and inner lives we were enmeshed with when we were reading. And it felt very almost, I don't want to say revolutionary, but it felt very different. Because again, like I said, Mary Shelley did that with Frankenstein. This was the first time I had really seen it done that way with vampires, that they weren't treated as just one-note cartoon villains, but creatures with like actual feelings and complications and struggles. And what really did it for me was a very similar thing to how I reacted when I read some early Clive Barker, particularly Cabal, which was made into the movie Nightbreed. What Anne Rice was doing here was she was taking the monster and turning the monster into the protagonist, the hero, the one you care about. And at the time, you know, I'd grown up gay in the South in the 80s. And to me, I knew society saw me as the monster. They saw me as the thing that needed to be vanquished to protect society. So reading fiction that took the monster and gave you their perspective and turned them into the hero was very profound and powerful to me, because it seemed like more than just the sum of its parts. It felt real and relatable to me in a way, because it made me feel seen. And also in this book, even though her vampires don't have actual sex, that's just not a part of their world, there was such an easy, casual, non-judged intimacy between male characters that it was very striking to me, because again, in that time period, you didn't really see that in works of horror or fantasy. And even the whole tableau where Lestat and Louis turned the child into a vampire, I mean, just visually, that's very much looking like a same-sex couple raising a child. And I mean, that stuff wasn't lost on me. It really, it made the novel feel deeper to me, just beyond the story it was telling.
All right, well, that sort of brings us to why, I believe, why you chose this for this episode. We were sort of, when we were talking about doing this, you were throwing some ideas out. Misery was one of your suggestions. I think there may have been one or two others that I don't recall, but you came back to this because you said, correct me if I'm wrong, but essentially that it's an important book to the gay community. It's an important book to you.
It is. I do think, you know, I know Anne Rice said in a lot of videos that early on it was the gay audience that really kept this book alive. You know, in those 9 years before she wrote another one, she said it was the gay audience that was still buying it and discussing it, because especially at the time there was so little for us, especially in genre fiction, that it did feel kind of like a revelation to us that she was treating intimacy between men and as something not to be judged, something not to be feared, but treating it like an actual beautiful thing. You know, even though she was using the metaphor of vampires, I think it really was a big deal for the gay community. You know, these days there's a lot more, even in genre fiction, for gay readers to latch onto. So I wonder if the younger gay readers have the same experience of finding that one book that really changes things for them when they have a lot more options, if you know what I mean.
Right.
But then, you know, I read this, and very shortly after this, I read Lost Souls by Poppy Z. Bright, which is a very different take on vampires. But Poppy Z. Bright, he also really just unashamedly utilized gay characters, and those things really did a lot for me because I didn't know you could have gay characters or themes in horror before that because I never saw it. And then Clive Barker came out around that same time publicly. I know a lot of people always say, well, everyone in the industry knew. Well, I wasn't in the industry. I was living in Gaffney, South Carolina. So when he came out publicly, it was a big deal to me. But yeah, I do feel like for a gay audience, I mean, not that it's just for a gay audience, but there's a specific resonance that this book has for us that sort of transcends just the tale of the vampires. But I also just think it's a really good vampire story. I mean, there's stuff in it like the Theater of the Vampires where they're masquerading as a theater troupe that is putting on a play, but they're actually killing people in front of an audience for their entertainment. Like that's some interesting horror stuff going on there. So I think there's a lot just for horror fans and vampire fans, but then I think there's a lot of deeper stuff in there as well if you want it.
Now his name just flew in and out of my head. Wow. How can I have forgotten his name? Who played Armand in the movie?
Oh, Antonio Banderas.
Thank you. Yeah, literally. I was like, all right, I'm going to ask him if Antonio Banderas played Armand, and then his name was gone. I'm getting old. That's the problem. Right. So yeah, we had Antonio Banderas as Armand, Tom Cruise, Lestat, Brad Pitt as Louis, Christian Slater's the reporter, right? The interviewer. Yeah. Now, do you feel that the movie holds up to the book? Is it as good? Does it do anything better or worse?
I think it's surprisingly effective and faithful because like I said, this book doesn't have like a real strong through line.
Right.
It's just episodic. And I'm surprised that a big studio film that invested so much money would be that faithful to the book. Because, that's not the way a lot of big studio movies are made. But, and there was a big controversy at first because when they first cast Tom Cruise, Anne Rice was very upset. I was never that upset. I did think it was odd when I first heard it. When I first heard they cast Tom Cruise, I thought he was going to play Louis. Because physically, he looks like Louis, and Louis is the main character of this book, and Tom Cruise at the time was a much bigger star than Brad Pitt. But then when I found out, I thought, okay, well, we'll see how that plays out. I was most concerned about the casting of Claudia because that's a very complicated role for a child to play. And I was actually very pleasantly surprised by how well Kirsten Dunst managed that role. I mean, they did make her older. She's much younger in the book than she is in the movie. But still, Kirsten Dunst was pretty young to be playing that. Antonio Banderas, to me, was a weird casting choice because Armand is very young in the book. He's like a teenager that gets made into a vampire. So Antonio Banderas, they went in a different direction there. But I actually thought I was impressed by how well they stuck to the book. I mean, they had to cut it down, but I felt like they kept all the important parts, much different than what they did with the Queen of the Damned movie. Bore very little resemblance to the book. They just took some character names and some plot points and then just told their own story. But the original Interview with the Vampire was really, and I really thought Tom Cruise did a really great job capturing that Lestat spirit, which, he won over Anne Rice as well. But yeah, I think that's a great movie. We watched it not long ago as well.
I believe I first saw a Claudia type character in the movie Near Dark, where they
Yeah,
also had a young actor, someone who was turned into a vampire as a child and now has
yeah,
lived that way for hundreds of years.
yeah,
But that's such a completely different movie.
yeah,
And that character, I think, is treated completely differently than Claudia in the
yeah,
book or the movie. But I do like that sort of that juxtaposition of, it's a child who's been alive for so long that they're not a child, but physically, which
they're trapped in that body. Yeah,
which one can be incredibly frustrating, or is always incredibly frustrating for the person. But on the other hand, I think could also be an advantage to a vampire, because who's gonna be afraid of a kid?
yeah,
You know, you have that sort of built-in trap for humans, a
yeah.
crying child on the street.
And I feel like in Interview with the Vampire, they played on both of those because I feel like the defining quality of Claudia was that she was incredibly frustrated
Yes.
being trapped in that body and not being able to move freely. Um, and they also had that side where it was very easy for her to lure in victims.
Hmm.
Um, I love Near Dark. That's probably one of my favorite vampire movies. But and I Homer was the name of the kid in that one. I just always there's a part where um, he's attracted to the main character's younger sister and wants to turn her to a vampire, but I'm like, but you're not really a kid, so
But
it's kind of weird.
but that's the thing. Is he attracted to her, or does he just want to turn her so he'll have a companion that's
Yeah,
his age, close to his age, and who will eventually be in the same situation? They'll both eventually be, very old adults in mind, and so they'll have. So I don't know that he was necessarily attracted to her,
well,
because that would make him
maybe.
a pedophile, which I didn't get, but
I don't know. It's a it's a thin line Homer is treading there because until she does age enough, it's just going to be a
yes,
weird relationship. But
absolutely.
but yeah, I do think Interview was good, but I'm interested in because AMC is making a new show. Um, but I don't know how different it's going to be. I know that it was something that Anne Rice was working on before she died. Um, but I know they're not going in the direction she had originally wanted, which was she wanted them to start with the vampire Lestat and
Okay.
then tell the story, and then eventually they would get to the events of Interview with the Vampire. But everything I've seen about the new show is they're doing Interview with the Vampire. Um, but I know they've made some changes with Louis, and Claudia is older now, and so I don't know. I'm willing to give it a shot. I know they're also supposed to be doing her Witching Hour as a miniseries as well.
TV adaptations, I think, are such a coin toss. You never know what you're going to get.
I mean,
Um,
and I feel like they have better potential for books because they can be. You don't have to concentrate everything down to an hour and a half or 2 hours, but can actually tell a longer story. And sometimes I think that works very well. I know there was a John Green book that was turned into a Hulu miniseries, Looking for Alaska, which I thought worked very well. So in some ways, the episodic nature of TV, I feel like gives it more room to actually adapt the book. But I don't know. I feel like adaptions these days, especially, I mean, I always know you have to make changes because it's a different medium, but I feel like they don't have to make as many changes as they do.
well, yeah, I like the idea of the longer, more time to play with to tell the story. But the thing that comes to my mind is The Mist. I absolutely love the novella. I love the movie. I watched the first 3 episodes of the TV show and could not take any more. I thought it was horrible.
Well, you're the majority opinion. My husband and I didn't mind that when we watched that whole season, but to me, what I kept in mind is this is not an adaptation of The Mist. I mean, it was not remote. It wasn't remotely related to the novella. Like it really was just they took the idea of The Mist and told a completely different story.
See, and
But I
that
mean,
doesn't bother me. I just felt that it was a bad story they were telling.
well, I don't know. I just wish because The Mist is actually one that I use as an example because not too long ago I reread the novella and I had forgotten how much stuff the movie takes directly out of the novella. I mean,
Mm.
dialogue directly out of there. There are visuals that come directly from the novella. And I feel like I rarely see that now. Like I talk about Bird Box, which was a good Netflix movie, but it's basically the story. But there's nothing in that movie where I'm like, that's directly from the book. They take the idea and the characters, but there's no dialogue, there are no specific scenes that play out. And I'm like, I kind of miss that when an adaptation would actually, because sometimes when I'm reading something and I know they're about to make it into a movie or a show, there are parts when I'm reading where I'm like, oh, I really want this to be in there. But nowadays, I feel like they don't lift things directly from them as much and put them in there, if that makes any sense.
Now, I don't need my adaptations to be perfect clones of the source material. I am in the minority, I think, in that I like in the new Pet Cemetery movie that it's the daughter that's killed and not Gage. I hate that they spoiled it in the trailers, but I like that they made that change. And like I said, with The Mist, it wasn't that it was a slavish adaptation of the story. I felt every decision might be a slight exaggeration, but almost every decision any character made was stupid. Um, I thought they telegraphed way too many things. Um, like the only thing that I thought anyone did that was smart was in the mall when they used a drone to go down the hallway and look around and see if it was clear. That's I did not, I was so excited for it. I just didn't, I didn't think it was a well-made show.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to think, uh, almost completely on the other end of the spectrum. Resident Alien is a show that I watch on Sci-Fi Channel that's based on a comic book. Very, very different than the comic book, but a fantastic show. At least the first season was great. Second season's a little weaker, but yeah, I don't know how we got on this whole the adaptation. Because
Interview.
yes, interview going to be a show. Um, Now you said that you liked seeing these uh, the relationship between male characters, even though it's not a sexual relationship because vampires aren't sexual. Um, but it was important to see them in these relationships. But um, how does it compare, contrast to say something like Hap and Leonard, which to me the greatest bromance in literature. Um, I absolutely love those characters and their relationship. Do you see that? Do you see that the same way, or is it different because it's a straight man and a gay man, whereas you have these sort of asexual beings in the vampires?
Well, And I will say that, Anne Rice's vampires are asexual, but in her other novels, there's a lot of man-on-man action. So she doesn't shy away from that. But I love the Hap and Leonard series. I love, Joe Lansdale. What I love about the friendship between Hap and Leonard is that you got some of this when they made the short-lived TV series, but in the book especially, sometimes they just have these conversations. I think it was in the second one, Mucho Mojo, where they just had a conversation where Leonard was asking Hap, like, how do you feel about the fact that your best friend is gay? And Hap was saying, like, it's kind of weird to him when he thinks about it, but he loves Leonard, and so he doesn't care. So it doesn't matter if it seems weird to him because he doesn't have to do it. But they have these, and I can't remember which book, there was a conversation where Leonard's boyfriend was almost jealous of Hap.
Mm-hmm.
And Leonard was telling him, like, there's nothing romantic between us, but there's something between us that's always going to be stronger,
right,
than anything else because we're brothers.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think there's something interesting, and those books are from Hap's point of view, so you get much more about what's going on with Hap. But Leonard has boyfriends in the series. He talks about sex. So to me, like, Leonard is a character that does have that dynamic to him. He's not just, oh, we said Leonard was gay, we're never going to mention that again. So I actually love that series. I love the way they handle that. I've heard he was planning, or maybe he already did, I don't know, but I know he said he was thinking about at some point writing some stories, some short stories from Leonard's point of view. Mm-hmm. I would find that very interesting to read because you do get him just through, because it's first person Hap stories.
Right.
So you are getting him filtered through Hap's point of view. But I do think he's a dynamic three-dimensional character, and I do love their friendship, because especially when they started coming out in the 80s, you didn't see any like straight man, gay man friendships going on. I just feel like there was a time where that wasn't something you saw. Like, you see that much more now. So I really do love how that was handled.
All right. And actually, I just recently rewatched Tremors, a movie I absolutely love. And that's another male-male relationship that, to me, is as strong and as entertaining as Hap and Leonard. Yeah. Is Earl and Val. Just, two guys that love each other completely platonically, but would kill for each other, die for each other. Just an incredible relationship, I think.
I will say this is a little off topic, but related to Tremors, which is a movie I love. I can't remember her name, but the actress who played like the lead in that, like the love interest for Kevin Bacon.
Rhonda is the character's name. Finn Carter, I believe, is the actress's name.
I loved her. I first discovered her. She used to be on a soap opera that I watched. She was Sierra on As the World Turns, if anybody remembers. But also in an 80s movie that I was obsessed with called How I Got Into College. Because back then I never thought I would go to college, so it was like a fascinating that. But I loved that actress, and I loved her in that movie. And I know they made some sequels, and there was once talk about Kevin Bacon maybe coming back. Mm-hmm. But I always thought, like, well, what about Finn Carter? like let's bring Kevin Bacon and Finn Carter, because I feel like
Right.
sometimes the woman is considered dispensable. Because I've always said the only thing at this point that would make me watch a new Die Hard movie is if they brought Bonnie Bedelia back. Because in the first two movies, I did not think he was inconsequential. Like, she was one of my main focuses.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I loved her in those movies. And then after the second one, they just did away with her.
Right.
And I mean, the only reason I watched that Crystal Skull Indiana Jones movie was because they brought back Karen Allen from the first one. So, like, let's bring back the women sometimes too. That's all I'm saying.
Well, I guess the question is, do you see a difference between, say, the relationship between Louis and Lestat, or Louis and Armand, and characters like Earl and Val, or Hap and Leonard?
Well, I do, just because even though the vampires don't have actual sexual intercourse, I do feel like their relationships are romantic.
Okay.
They're not just friends. Like, I feel like they actually are, and it's in some of the last books that she wrote, it's much like I don't, but there are a couple of characters that sort of reunite after a really long time, and it is clear to me like they're a couple, like they're in love, they want to spend eternity together. They just don't, sex isn't a thing in the vampire world that Anne Rice created, but yeah, I definitely, because I see their relationships as love and romance,
Okay.
as opposed to just friendships. I love a good buddy picture too, but yeah, I definitely see something different there. I see an actual deep love that is romantic even without the sexual component.
So it's everything just except the sex.
Yeah. It's always interesting. I always wondered like why she made that decision. I think I've heard her say something like, for her, she thought for a vampire, the drinking blood would be the sexual release. So it seemed like she wanted to take that out, but because like I said, in other novels, it's definitely in there.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so it's definitely, but it's not just. I mean, there's lots of love between male and female characters. I mean, it's interesting that she uses a lot fewer female characters, actually, in a lot of her series. I know a fan favorite is Gabrielle, who is Lestat's mother, who he turns into a vampire after he's made into one. But she's often said that she's not a particular fan of that character, which is why she's never had a bigger thing. But although she did use a lot of female characters in her Witching Hour books, because most of those, the Mayfair witches, were women. But I'll be interested to see how that's, because there's been very few Anne Rice adaptations. There was Interview with the Vampire. There was the Queen of the Damned. I've never seen it, but I know they turned her erotic novel Exit to Eden.
Oh, right. Yeah. I forgot about that.
They turned it into a weird comedy with Rosie O'Donnell.
Yeah.
So not exactly what her novel was. And then I don't think most people have seen it, but her historical drama about the free people of color in New Orleans before the Civil War, Feast of All Saints, was turned into a beautiful Showtime miniseries. And I can't find it streaming anywhere. We had to buy the DVD to watch it. But that I was surprised by that one too, how faithful it was to the book.
Nice. Now, I have to ask, since I never read anything past Interview, does the interviewer, now I believe at the end he goes looking for Lestat. He wants to be turned.
Mm-hmm.
Louis refused to do it. Is that addressed? Does the interviewer does he come back? Does he get turned? Or is that the last we see of him?
He does come back. He comes back, I believe, in the third one. I believe it's Interview with I believe it's Queen of the Damned. And he gets a name. Because I remember
He's not just the boy?
What's that?
He's not just the boy?
No. Because I believe the chapter he comes back in is called Daniel or the Interviewer. But he comes back and he becomes a character that recurs actually throughout the series. I mean, and sometimes she'll go a while. Like in the book Interview with the Vampire, this character doesn't even get mentioned in the movie. But right before Claudia turns on Lestat in the book, Lestat has made a new vampire companion who doesn't have a name. They just call him the violin player.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that vampire comes back in Prince Lestat years later, also gets a name. And I remember that was one of my favorite parts because I had almost forgot about that character and never knew what became of him. But I like that. But yeah, Daniel comes back, and even obviously Claudia meets a tragic end at the end of Interview with the Vampire. But while she never is a character again, they deal with her and Louis' grief still over her in the book Merrick, which I thought was nice that she still pays tribute to the history of the characters.
She sort of went from being a vampire to a ghost, metaphorically speaking.
The whole premise of Merrick is that Louis finds Merrick, who is a witch, who can communicate with the dead sometimes, to see if he can get in touch with Claudia so that he can, tell her how sorry he is and how much he misses her. And that's the book Lestat really comes back, because after Memnoch the Devil, Lestat's not really a part of the series, because that's when they're doing Armand and Blood and Gold, which is about Marius and Pandora and Vittori. So it's not till Merrick that Lestat really comes back into the mix of the series.
All right. There's a couple of non-interview with the vampire things I wanted to talk about.
Okay.
And I planned on it before we got into the main event, but we things just started flowing. So let's sort of wrap this up. Is there anything else that you want to say about the book, Interview with the Vampire? Any particular parts of the book you want to talk about? Any more about the impact that it had on you? Any final thoughts?
Well, I mean, I think I'll just say, because Anne Rice did pass away, just a few months ago. And I mean, to me, I know she is a very polarizing writer. Some people love her, some people absolutely loathe her. And I mean, I can see that her writing is very almost not of this century. She has a very old-fashioned style that feels like it belongs in a bygone Gothic era. And she is very free-flowing. That's why some of her novels are very episodic and not like one main plot. And she loves details. But there's something about it, like I can read a 5-page description of a banquet table and be fascinated. But to me, I feel like there's nobody else working today like her. And I feel like her death has left kind of a void in the literary world. But and that's one of the main reasons I wanted, because I have a lot of favorites, but I wanted to talk about this one. One, because I wanted to talk about Anne Rice. And again, this one has a specific resonance to me as a gay man. But yeah, I think she changed vampire literature forever. I think a lot of the vampire stuff that's done today harkens back to her. And yeah, I feel like I'm just babbling, but yeah, I love Anne Rice, and I think she is going to live on through her work.
Okay, one final question about this. Of all the vampire books that she wrote, the whole series, if you had to recommend one, for someone who has never read Anne Rice, which one would it be?
I'm going to cheat and say
Okay.
either The Vampire Lestat, because I think I think The Queen of the Damned is a better novel.
Okay.
It doesn't make as much sense if you haven't read The Vampire Lestat.
Right.
Because it really, they're kind of connected in a way that none of the others are.
Okay.
The Vampire Lestat, I think, is a wonderful introduction. But for a complete standalone, the fourth novel, Tale of the Body Thief, which to me, in a weird way, reminds me of The Mummy because it's more of an adventure romp, and it has a very self-contained story that isn't dependent on any of the other books, and it's just a lot of fun. So I would say just for the sheer greatness of it, The Vampire Lestat, and just for the standalone adventure of it, Tale of the Body.
All right. Very cool. Thank you for that. Okay. So the two things that I had wanted to talk about earlier, I have to pull out my little notebook here that's in the arm of my chair. Recently, you had a book come out from Unnerving Press as part of their Rewind or Die, Tales from the Typewriter.
Just happen to have it.
Look at that. Now, it's number 32, and I've been buying them in order. Every time I order something from Amazon, I tack on the next Rewind or Die book. I just got book 26.
Okay.
So I'm getting closer, and I have a notebook. You can see I've crossed off some, and there's the ones I don't have yet. So this is a short story collection, correct?
It is. Yeah.
And is it all original material to this book?
It is. Yes.
Okay, so how did you get hooked up with Unnerving and the Rewind or Die to put this collection out?
Well, I had published with them before. I had published a novella that I co-wrote with James Newman with them, and I had published a previous short story collection called The Daylight Will Not Save You. And Eddie, who runs Unnerving, just sent me an email one day and said, he was looking for authors for the Rewind or Die series and asked if I had between 7 and 10 stories that were along the same theme, and if I could write a wraparound story to sort of tie them all together. And I have hundreds and hundreds of unpublished short stories. So I went through to see, because I had a couple of different ideas of different thematically linked stories. But when I was looking through them, I saw that I did have a lot of stories about writers and writing. And then I also had this idea about a haunted typewriter that would start typing at night. And then the whole mystery was, what is it going to say if you put a piece of paper in? And I realized I could take that idea and turn it into the wraparound story. And so that what the typewriter was typing were the stories that will be in the collection. And so I had a lot of fun crafting that story and weaving it between and picking, because I had a lot more than 10 stories on that theme. So I had to narrow it down. I think I ended up with 7 that I put in the book. Because one of them is kind of longish, almost a novella in itself. But yeah, so I had a lot of fun picking them, and I really liked how the wraparound turned out. So I'm very excited.
Now, from the books in the series that I have read so far, they all have either an 80s setting or an 80s sort of B-movie feel to them. There are some that take place modern day, but still feel like an 80s B movie. Do your stories in this book sort of fit in there, or is it a little different than that?
I feel like a lot of my work, because I came of age in the 80s, and a lot of my influences are from the 80s, not just books, but TV shows and movies. So a lot of my stuff inadvertently has that kind of feel. Um, I think a lot of them have more of a, and I probably said this on the last time I was here, but I'm very Twilight Zone influenced.
Hmm.
And I definitely think some of them have a Twilight Zone feel. So I would say it probably feels a little more Twilight Zone-ish.
Okay.
But they did do an 80s Twilight Zone, and I watched it a lot.
There you go. I do have to say, well, I mean, I don't have to say, I choose to. One of my favorite short story collections ever is Deadlines by John Skipp and Craig Spector.
Yeah.
Because it's a novel that's also a short story collection.
Yeah.
And I when I bought it, I had no idea that it was it had their short stories in it.
Yeah.
But the idea that this woman moves into an apartment that was previously being used by a writer, and she finds his manuscripts and sits down and reads them, and then those are the John Skipp and Craig Spector short stories.
Yeah.
Blew me away. And I had read a lot of their stuff in Twilight Zone magazine, and that's when I was like, oh, I've read this story before. But it's not even just a wraparound story.
Yeah.
For these shorts, it's a novel in and of itself, which just I absolutely love. I still love that.
I mean, I was just talking to somebody the other day where I was talking about, you know, what I was drawing from when I was planning the wraparound, but I mentioned Deadlines because I'd read that, and of course, the Books of Blood have sort of a wraparound.
Mm-hmm.
There's The Illustrated Man by Ray Bradbury, and I like that. I mean, I love short stories, so just give me any short story collection and I'll be happy. But I do think it's a lot of fun when you have these things that connect it all together and make it seem like one whole story, even with all the short stories in it.
Yes. Well, I'm certainly looking forward to it. 6 more orders from Amazon, and I will have it. Excuse me. And then, of course, the other thing that we need to talk about is your upcoming novel. Novel?
It's the novella.
Okay. And I looked at the title of it right before we started, and now I don't recall. It has rain in the title, right?
When It Rains.
When It Rains. Okay. So, When It Rains, your new novella coming out. Tell us about it. Tell us all about it. Everything we need to know.
When It Rains, it comes out on March 25th from Crystal Lake Publishing. And it's a story about a strange rain that starts to fall that's sort of slimy. But it starts to fall everywhere globally at the same time. And no one knows what it is or what has caused it. And even though it's happening globally, the story concentrates on a group of people in a university bookstore cafe who are sort of waiting it out, trying to figure out what's going on. And the paranoia and fear that starts creeping up as people start thinking it has to be something toxic. So the people who were caught out in the rain might have something wrong with them or be contagious, and all these tensions start to arise. I mean, it's sort of Mist-like in that sense. But I actually wrote it at the very beginning of the pandemic when I was furloughed from work for what turned out to be 2 months. I needed something to channel my anxiety into and something to keep me occupied. And so I told myself while I was out of work, I'm just going to pretend I'm a full-time writer. I'm going to trick my mind into thinking that. And so I sat down and I was very disciplined and I treated it like my job. But I mean, like everything, when I write, I was also having a great time. And, by the end, I was like, I don't know if this is good or bad, but it has succeeded in giving me a vehicle to channel my anxiety. So it was very special to me. It just so happens that around the same time I finished it, Crystal Lake Publishing opened up for a sub period. So I sent it in and they accepted it. And like I said, it's special to me because of the circumstances, but I also feel like I told a good story, and I'm excited for people to read it.
Now, you've had a number of things come out through Crystal Lake, correct?
I've worked with them quite a bit, and I really love working with them, so I'm always excited when they accept something else of mine.
Now, you said March 25th?
Yes.
Is the release date. I'm just going to take a glance at my calendar. Looking at the calendar over there. I'm going to look at the whiteboard over here just to verify the fact that this episode that we are recording right now is going to go up on YouTube on March 24th.
Oh, so buy it tomorrow, people.
How's that for some timing?
Pre-order, it'll come to you tomorrow.
Yes, pre-order it. 1 day pre-order. Yeah, as soon as you said that date, I was like, I think that's when this episode's going to go up. And it is. It's Kismet. All right. Anything else at all that you'd like to plug or mention or just shout out?
Nothing in particular. I mean, like I said, I do have Tales from the Typewriter. When it rains, check it out. You might like it. But you know, as I always tell people, just read books. Just read what you love. Don't care what anyone else says you should be reading, except my books. You should be reading my books. But other than that, just read, enjoy it. That's it.
All right. And where can people find you online?
I'm on the Facebook. I'm on Twitter at Mark A. Gunnells. I'm on Instagram as Make Reading Cool Again. But really all I do on there is post pictures of books. And I have a blog at markgunnells.livejournal.com. I have an Amazon author page where you can find all of my works. But Facebook and Twitter are the two I am on most.
I'll have some links to some things in the description below, as I do. All right, I think that's it. So if you can just hang out for a moment, and I'll do my outro. Thank you very much to Mark Allan Gunnells for being here, talking about Interview with the Vampire. I always used to think it was but it's the. Yes. So folks, if you have any comments or questions, put them in the comments below. Please like, share, and subscribe. You know, all the YouTube stuff. I think that covers everything. So until next time, folks, read more books.